Greetings to all. Today we are going to talk about business intelligence, a little bit about data governance as a consequence of a good business intelligence project, and how this helps transform information into value. A definition that you will find, and there are many of them on the internet, of what business intelligence is, says that it is a set of practices, processes, and technologies that, through the analysis of existing data within an organization, support management and decision-making. Look, this is the most important part, right? Because supporting the management of a company is important. But when we talk about decision-making, we are already touching on the strategic dimension. Business intelligence covers everything from simple queries and reports through all kinds of analysis, what is known as online analytical processing, to more complex applications of segmentation and prediction, what is called data mining. Business intelligence basically takes data from an organization and transforms it in such a way that it becomes useful for people to manage their work and make decisions. We can move from data to information and from information to knowledge. Data are primary elements that, by themselves, are irrelevant. For example, I could say to you, systems engineering, 2025, 20,000. And if I ask you, how would you interpret these three pieces of data? You would probably say, well, they are not really telling us much. But if I say, in the year 2025, 20,000 students enrolled in the systems engineering program at UNAD, then I am taking those data and turning them into information. But if I gather more information, then we can go further. Look at what the definition says about information. It is a set of processed data that has meaning. So, if I take a lot of this information, I can build what is called knowledge. Look, a few years ago, this could only be done by a human being, generating knowledge from information. Another thing a human being can do is generate knowledge from existing knowledge. A simple example of this is people who pursue a doctorate. A person doing a doctorate, since it must involve research, if it is a serious doctoral program, must conduct research, and through that research, they must generate new knowledge based on previous knowledge, practices, information, and so on. So, look at the value of this. Knowledge is a mixture of experience, values, information, and know-how, which serves as a framework for incorporating new experiences and information and is useful for action. We cannot always make decisions easily because we do not have enough information, or we are missing information. Moreover, for some years now, it has been said that information is another asset of the company, and some have tried to value it just as they value certain assets. They have tried to value information, and it is not easy, but what is said is the following. In a company, in any organization, whether we call it a technology services company or any other type of organization, whether for-profit or non-profit, if it manages information, you have realized today the value of information and the impact it has when a company loses information. I don't know if you read recently that a very large company, a very large one, I will give you the information in a moment. I am going to check it here on my phone, developed something impressive using artificial intelligence. I will tell you the name of the company in a moment. They created a development where, precisely because of the size of the company, they carried out a very large project. And much of that project was done with artificial intelligence, of course, using a series of very expensive resources. And then a hacker came in. Yes, a hacker came in. The company is called McKinsey & Company. And this hacker spent 2 hours and $20. Yes, that is what he spent, to buy a simple artificial intelligence software. And with that, he hacked this company. And what did he put at risk? He put at risk all the information of this company, McKinsey and Company. If any of you are curious and want to look it up, I can write it there for you. It says that McKinsey and Company developed a platform called Lily, which is used by more than 43,000 employees. All this knowledge that is generated, and now knowledge is being generated with artificial intelligence, makes us think that it is no longer only the human being who does this. However, we must be very careful. That is why when you use artificial intelligence for your assignments, you need to remember that artificial intelligence is a support tool, but the final decision must actually be made by the person. It can guide us based on parameters. For example, I cannot read 100 documents in a matter of seconds, but artificial intelligence can do that. It can produce summaries for me, but my experience and my knowledge are still needed to validate whether those readings and summaries are actually correct. So we have to be very careful. Now, decision-making. Look, making decisions in a company is something that belongs to management. Remember that a company is like a pyramid. Look at this pyramid we have here. The difference is that in the organizational pyramid, at the top we have the strategic level, in the middle the tactical level, and at the base the operational level. Decisions are made at the strategic level. The people who define the company's strategies are those at the highest level, presidents, managers, and so on. And in order to do all of this, they need knowledge. And to have knowledge, they need information. Business intelligence, or inteligencia de negocios, has a series of maturity levels, which we are going to mention and explain here. The first stage is transforming and loading data in order to generate information. What does transforming mean? There is even a term for this, a term that is called ETL, although it is now being re-evaluated with recent developments. Let me write it here so you can see it. It is called ETL. What does it mean? It means extracting, transforming, and loading. The L stands for load in English. So it is extract, transform, and load, ETL. In other words, I extract the information, I transform it, and then I load it. Since business intelligence is based on data, we now need to take the following into account. Those data are generally structured data. For example, imagine that you have an Excel sheet where you have, let's say, the ID number, the name, the email account, the date of birth, and the home address. Let's suppose you have those data there, and we have the data of 30 students. Now, that is one option. Another option would be that you have a letter addressed to you, which says something like, Cali, May, date. Mr. So-and-so, I am pleased to inform you that you have been awarded a scholarship for an amount of X to carry out the following activities. It contains data because it includes different pieces of information. For example, the place, the address, the person to whom it is addressed, and the subject. Exactly. Now, this is easy to understand. So, suppose I wrote a letter for each of the 30 students. In other words, I wrote 30 letters. And suppose that in an Excel spreadsheet, I entered the data of those 30 students, plus the reason why I was sending them the letter. For you, what would be easier to read? The Excel file or the 30 letters? The Excel file is a matrix, right? That is basically what a matrix is. It has rows and columns where the data are structured. In one column, you have the ID number. In another column, you have the name. In another column, you have the last name. Then in another column, the email address, and so on. Could you do the same thing with a letter? In other words, could you say, in this part goes the name, in this part goes the last name, in this part goes the ID number, and in this part goes this other piece of information? You could try to do it, but it cannot really be done in the same way. Exactly. So, since it cannot be done that way, this is where we are currently making use of artificial intelligence to see how we can extract some of those data and structure them. That is, place them in a structured format. And why do we place them in a structured format? So that we can analyze them, so that we can analyze those data. So, I can have data from different sources, from different data sources. At this point, remember that social media has already become a very important source of information. Well, it has two components. One good and one not so good, let's say. The good part is that when it is used with valid information and the reports are valid, that is excellent. But you have probably noticed that a lot of garbage is circulating on social media, right? And now, with artificial intelligence, even more garbage is circulating because people are inventing videos, creating false content, and even scamming people. Because, look, there is always someone who uses these tools for harmful purposes. Look at what I just mentioned. A person with $20 in 2 hours hacked the system. He found an error in the development that had been created by a large team in this company with more than 43,000 users. He found a small error, got in through that vulnerability, and hacked them. So we may ask ourselves, to what extent can bad things also be done through the management of information? That is why in many companies, and I do not know if you have noticed this, some employees are not even allowed to bring in a USB drive. It is forbidden, absolutely forbidden. Exactly, fake news. And look at how people are now trying to scam everyone. You receive messages saying things like, "Your loan has been approved. Click on this link to continue the process." Clicking on that link means you are already in trouble, right? With that action, they may already have gained access to one of your accounts and scammed you. That is why you should never open a link just because you received a message claiming to be from the bank. What you should do is call the bank and ask, "Are you carrying out this process?" And the bank will probably tell you, "No, that is a scam. So please do not open that link." In other words, the recommendation is never open links that are sent to you unexpectedly. So look, data are becoming what I mentioned earlier, an asset of the company. Why? Because data can be transformed into information, and information can be transformed into knowledge. Now, what would be the purpose of having information and knowledge? Well, as we have discussed, it is useful for decision-making. First, it is useful for management, right? First, for managing. What does it mean to manage? What would management mean to you? What is managerial? Some people are using the word management more than administration or managerial administration. What they say, and some of us agree, is that administration only administers. Management, on the other hand, means administering and doing. But again, there may be many different concepts here. Planning, strategies, and so on. You can plan a strategy, but in order to carry out that strategy, you have to manage it. Because you can plan something, and this is what happens in many places. You make plans and everything, but if you do not carry them out, if you do not implement them, if you do not execute them, then you have not really done anything. It remains only as something on paper. Good. So let's go back and review a little. We said that a maturity cycle of business intelligence involves extracting information, transforming it. That is, what I showed you with ETL, extract, transform, and load in order to generate information. It also involves having access to different sources of information. So look, here we are talking about data. Actually, in this part, I would remove the word information. I would say it is more about transforming and loading. The information would come here. In other words, I transform this into information, I develop knowledge, and I make decisions. Look, I make decisions, and then there is action. Here it says action. So knowledge, information, and data. Now, the value of information has become extremely important. Why? Because today many companies, and perhaps some of you, who want to become business owners or entrepreneurs, sell services. One of the things that began to be sold, I would say around 20 years ago, perhaps a little more, was services. There is an anecdote about IBM. IBM noticed that smaller competing companies were becoming very successful. So they called in a consultant and asked him, "What is happening with IBM?" And the consultant told them, "It is simple. What is happening is that you are not selling services." So other companies were selling services, and what was needed at that moment was services. Of course, there are companies that continue producing, excuse the repetition, they continue making products. They continue making juices, food products, cleaning products, and so on. All of those are products, and they will continue to exist. New products will be launched, new inventions will be made, and so forth. However, the service sector started to gain a lot of strength. Again, I would say around 20 years ago. So companies began to work on services and to offer services. For example, you might say, "I am going to offer a service in information analytics." Dear company, I am going to analyze your information. I am going to take your data. But then the question is, where are my data? That is why I was asking you about sources of information, because it turns out that my data are located in different sources. We said that one source could be social media, for example. Another source could be data stored in Excel files. There are also databases that store large volumes of data. And within databases, there are different types of databases. For example, I can have a bibliographic database, which stores all the documentary resources of an institution, such as a university. I can also have a database that stores financial data or academic data in the case of a university. So I would have different sources of information. Data analytics extracts those data from the different sources of information. That is why it says here, transform. But actually here, this does not let me change it anymore. However, I would really say it this way. I am going to place it on top, since this is being recorded, and you can remember it. So what I would actually write here is the following: extract, load, and transform. I would put it like this. And you, since you are PowerPoint experts, maybe you can fix that later. So here, for example, I am going to place a little box, something like this. I would organize it like this: extract, load, and transform. And here we would have information. So here, I convert data into information. What I do is convert it into information. What do I convert into information? Those data sources, or rather, all those data, I convert them into information. But look at the following. When I extract, load, and transform, especially when I am going to extract, I have sources, data sources. Yes, I have data sources and I have different data sources. So I am going to extract. And where am I going to extract the data from? I have to identify which sources I need. For example, we mentioned a database, Excel files, and letters. So since those data are not structured, I would have to take those letters, extract the data from them, and structure them. That is, place them in a structured format. Then I load them, and then I transform them. What does transforming mean? Let's suppose I am extracting data, and I am going to talk, for example, about the case of a university. I am going to extract academic data. From one source or from several sources, I am going to extract administrative data, or let's call them financial data. So I have academic data. For example, the students and all the student characteristics, what they are studying, what program they are enrolled in, what semester they are taking, how many credits they are going to register, and how much their tuition costs. And on the financial side, I know how much each credit costs, how much that student's tuition is, whether they paid in installments, whether they paid by credit card, by check, in cash, and so on. So I have two sources. Let's suppose there are only two sources of information, the financial area and the academic area. Then I have to load that information and transform it. And what does transforming mean in this case? It means that I have to connect those data sources so that when I carry out the analytical process, I can work with them together. Because this is where the interesting part of business intelligence comes in. I can say, for example, this number of students paid their tuition on time. This number used ITEA credit. This number used a loan from another bank. This number still has half of the payment pending, and so on. So at that point, what I have done is develop knowledge. Now, how did I convert those data into information? Some of you might say, I am using Excel. There is a talk that I sometimes edit where people mention the anarchy of Excel. Do you know what anarchy means? Do you remember what anarchy means? It refers to the absence of government or state authority. In other words, it is like when everyone does whatever they want. There is no law, no order, no authority. So, at one point, people talked about the anarchy of Excel because everything was being done in Excel. Why? Because it was the only tool people knew. But when business intelligence software began to appear, things started to change. And that is because Excel, in any case, has limitations. Yes, starting with the fact that it has a specific number of rows. After a certain number of rows, Excel no longer accepts more data. In other words, if I have a file, for example, a file from a telecommunications company that manages millions of records, and I try to load it into Excel, Excel crashes because it cannot handle that volume. Another disadvantage, for example, is that in Excel I can change information, records can be lost. In other words, it is not a secure data source. It is useful for many things. I am not saying that Excel is bad. Excel is bad when it is used for something it was not designed for. And any computational tool is bad if it is used for something it was not made for. Excel is useful for many things. I can do many tasks with it, including something called operations research, but for other things it is not useful. It was not designed for that. Good. So I develop knowledge from information, and with that knowledge I make decisions. So look, this is the critical part of the business. Now that people are talking about new technologies, disruptive technologies, artificial intelligence, digital transformation, and so on, people are also talking about analytics, business intelligence. And within business intelligence, there is big data. What is big data? Big data means applying business intelligence to large volumes of data. Big data is working with large volumes of data and applying business intelligence to them. That is big data. So, look at the importance that data management has gained in universities. There are already many universities. This has spread in an impressive way. I do not know if you have noticed that many universities have started offering specializations and master's degrees in data science. Some programs combine these business intelligence topics with mathematics in order to complement certain aspects of data analysis. And that is how data science has been created, along with these academic programs, business intelligence, specializations, or master's degrees. At UNAD, I think there is one of the two, or maybe both. I think both, and other universities have also created similar programs. I would like to thank you all for your attention. I hope this information has helped provide context on the importance and proper use currently given to business intelligence. Best regards, I am Marco Rodríguez, General Manager of ITEA Solutions.